for this kind of invitation to speak to you all guys. This is great. You know, you need to know this is a homecoming for me. 25 years ago, I was sitting in this chair, and yeah, it's really a special place for me to come back into this lecture theatre. So it's really privileged to be here. So thank you very much to be here among friends and almost family. This is my first lecture on my new book. I was rather busy in the last couple of months. Some of you might have seen what happened in relation to our research at Liverpool. But some of you might know that I've written and collaborated quite a lot also with Professor Pence on film and architecture, and co-edited, in fact, a volume with François Cinematic Geographies. This book, The Art of Spatial Illusion, is very much an extension to and a further continuation of my concerns around visual culture, I guess, in relation to the built environment, and hopefully it sits well alongside the more film-focused publications that I have done. So, The Art of Spatial Illusion. I hope you find the title remotely interesting and thought-provoking. The Art of Spatial Illusion, to me, was written a bit as a response to a discourse on the notion of immersive experiences. There was a period when I started writing the book where a lot of people talked to me about installation work and other things, and seemingly everyone wanted to suddenly work with us and CAVA associates on immersive experiences. And a lot of these conversations I found were a little bit complicated to do, because it seemed to me that people understood different things around what an immersive experience really is. And quite often I found myself in the situation that people related it to very much like the technologies that we all sort of are so aware of. And so we see this notion of spatial illusion and immersive experiences from this kind of technological perspective that you see here on the screen here as well. Some guy perhaps wearing some sort of a headset and having a fantastic time seeing things in a unusual, spectacular way. But when it came to the Art of Spatial Illusion, I was way more interested in phenomena like the ones that you see here represented on the screen. For instance, the so-called camera obscura, a simple optical device that works on the principle that light passes, in this case, through a very small hole in the wall and functioning as an aperture, which then can project an inverted image onto a flat surface on the other side of the room, inside a darkened space. So this is kind of an example of an immersive experience where technology, I would say, apart from the very precisely drilled hole into a wall, probably isn't really relevant at all. So it is space that is actually in the foreground of the sensation of being spatially immersed. So that was my starting point for this conversation. So when I started to write this book, I wanted to set the record straight a bit, and tracing the history of immersive experiences through multiple lenses, obviously through my own lenses, which comes from architecture and design disciplines, but also through historical and profoundly theoretical and technological perspectives, revealing these immersive experiences' deep-rooted presence long before the digital age. And so I'm examining essentially spatial illusions, or we might call them spatially immersive experiences, and how they have evolved over time, for instance, through the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th centuries, and even before that, from early panoramic spectacles and cinematic immersions to architectural interfaces and today's hybrid environments where physical and digital realms begin to converge. And ultimately, the Art of Spatial Illusion challenges, hopefully, the assumption that immersion is a modern phenomenon. It is not. Instead, it's presented in the book as a long-standing cultural and technological pursuit that continues to redefine our interaction with space and place today. Now, my own perspective comes from the field of architecture, of course, and this book was inspired by scholars such as Walter Benjamin and Jean Baudrillard, meaning that in the books I discuss technological advancements and how they have transformed our situatedness in what I call an image space, highlighting the shift from a material authenticity towards digital reproductions. And the art of, in the subtitle in the title of the book, makes, of course, reference to and draws inspiration from Walter Benjamin's seminal text, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, that is written in 1935. So Benjamin talks about the then recent observable changes of techniques, for instance, in relation to the reproduction and transmission of works of art, and the kinds of innovations and developments which we actually might come to see and experience ourselves in the near future. So there's a subtitle to the book. Again, quite a bit of thought went to this. It has the subtitle Immersive Encounters Between People, mentioned first, Media and Place. And the term encounter holds for me a particular significance as it underscores a point that I believe is, again, rather relevant in a critical design discourse today. Traditionally, such encounters occurred within a controlled of an interior environment like a theater or cinema. However, today, spatial illusions and immersive experiences are becoming integral to a much bigger, what I would quote in inverted commas, an experience economy, permeating the realms of architecture and urban design. So my point here is that whether in a theater or an urban setting, we should not forget that we inhabit a highly constructive perspective of the world, where architecture and design spaces wield influence in our thoughts as well as our lived experiences. So I see this as a product of living in a contemporary age of experiences in which we as inhabitants of such illusionistic worlds increasingly expect our spatial surroundings to be responsive, uplifting, and even entertaining. We can see that the theatrical and fictional character of architecture and places are increasingly expressed, for instance, through the use of digital advertising, luminous displays, surface projections, and various other forms of spectacles, a trend that arguably will continue with a further increase of digital technologies in the future. I call this phenomena already in my last book, Mise en Urbanité, and I'll come back to this definition a little bit later, perhaps again. A common argument is that capitalism shapes places around consumerism and constructed messages and borrowed narratives, essentially reacting to external economic forces and to the dynamics of living in a capitalist system. However, I would like to draw attention that beneath these layers also lie a deep-seated human desire to immerse ourselves in narrative, illusionistic environments. We seem to enjoy visiting fabricated spaces infused with fictional stories. We're drawn to experiencing spatial illusions, fictional realms that afford us a privileged vantage point, an augmented sense of presence, and sometimes a shared experience. Now, the book took me quite a long time to write, and actually also I spent a lot of time to where I thought about how to structure this book, because it is a rather complex and large topic. I structured it into distinctive yet hopefully interconnected parts, and I called them the surface, the stage, the interface, and the hybrid. The book tries to highlight how our perception of space has evolved over time and how it has been shaped by an ongoing intricate interplay between architectural spaces, medias, and completely also ourselves. So these four parts that you see here represented on the screen are arranged approximately in a chronological order, but not precisely, tracing the developments from the 17th century to the present day. So this organizational structure allows hopefully also, and that certainly helped me, to pick and choose, to, for instance, take a deep dive into a particular time or a particular spatial illusion phenomena without necessarily reading the full book. Now, it's kind of an odd thing for me to say, but I'm just opening up. It's quite a big whopper. It's over 100,000 words, and I know we're all challenged on time, and so this is a book that is been written and built in such a manner that you can dip in and dip out, but also you can read the book actually in a different order if you really wanted to. Right, so let's get into the first part, and I'll just give you a few brief examples of what I mean by the surface. So in this first part of the book, I talk about the 17th, 18th, and 19th century and its immersive experiences, spatially immersive architectural settings that are carefully choreographed, designed, represented, and sometimes are representational spaces. I draw attention to the relationship between human creativity and technological advances in the pursuit of knowledge and power. And I think a good example that explains that further are so-called cabinets of curiosities. I go in quite some detail as to where this term actually comes from a etymological point of view. It's a starting point, really, for me to talk about this phenomenon, which you know as the precursor to modern museums. And these kind of collections that we would have seen of natural, exotic, and other artifacts kind of, to me, encapsulate the Renaissance and Enlightenment quest for knowledge, merging the natural world with spatial spectacle. So I'm inviting you, when you read the book, to traverse with me the liminal spaces between the tangible, i.e. the objects and paintings that are mounted onto flat surfaces, and the transcendent, and I mean by here the imagined stories behind of what is actually represented on these walls. And there's one more observation that I took when I studied these things. I see cabinet curiosities as environments that are essentially screen spaces, volumes of space. Yes, of course, three-dimensional volumes, but they were surrounded by drawings and objects that were positioned in such a way that they are flat onto a wall, and as such, mirroring to some extent the characteristics of screens. And we could talk about this a little bit more when you go to the Song Museum, for instance, how some of the wall open up like a stage and other things. But yeah, I just wanted to share this sort of brief notion about the cabinet's curiosities with you. Another spatial phenomena that I quite deeply explore are so-called panoramas. And some of you are maybe familiar with these panoramas. It's essentially an 18th century invention of form of a spatially immersive media encounter that offered an unrestricted 360-degree spatial experience. The panorama, if you don't know, was invented by an Irishman called Robert Barker in 1787. That's when he patented it. And what interested me is that alongside his technological innovation and idea of representing a landscape or a cityscape on a round flat screen, he also invented a system essentially to build a commercial enterprise around spatial immersion. He realized that people were willing to pay money for an attraction that would create a spatial illusion and place them in the center of an historical event or overlooking a city. And the overlooking the city is beautifully demonstrated in this very special panorama that you see here on the screen that I'm going to deep dive in just a moment's time. But perhaps before I do this, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the panorama paradox, which is obviously completely paradoxical because people would pay money to go in the inside of a dark, circular, fully enclosed space to gain an unrestricted view of an exterior world. So there's a paradox in itself of the piece of architecture and the experience that people would be willing to pay money for it. But going back to the panorama of London. The panorama view of London at the Colosseum. You see here the Colosseum, that was a building that was purpose-built for this attraction by Decimus Burton in 1822. Barker's innovation, you have to imagine, sparked a lot of interest of other proprietors and people and innovators who were interested to also make some money from the so-called panorama and use this as a kind of a platform for commercial ventures. And so a number of groundbreaking attractions popped up around that time. But this one is phenomenal, and I've seen very little written about it, certainly from an architectural point of view. So the Colosseum was built right next to the Regent Park between 1824 and 27 in London. And in the book, what I have done, rather than just describing the piece of architecture and, you know, God knows what it is, I follow the journey of the two men that were principally responsible for creating this panorama experience. And that is the surveyor Thomas Horner and the painter Edmund Thomas Harris, who created this truly gigantic and very precise panoramic image representation of London at the time. Now, and again, it's typical me, rather than talking about the object itself, I'm going to the context. And the first thing I ask myself the question is, like, where's the image coming from and what have they actually painted? And then you discover things which completely blew my mind. You discover things, for instance, that Thomas Horner apparently in 1821 wandered down on the roads of London and saw that St. Paul's Cathedral had a scaffolding built up to renovate the Golden Cross on the dome. And he had the idea, because he was a surveyor, to ask permission to climb up the tower and survey essentially London. Permission was granted, apparently, and not only that, he built a hut, a temporary hut on top of Golden Cross. So we're talking about him building something with his bare hands and some ropes and some wooden sticks at a height of over 111 meters in a situation that could imagine in the wind, the whole thing sort of sprang from one side to the other, a absolutely spectacular enterprise. And he initially wanted to produce a series of sketches, a precise representation of London at a certain, in a small format that he would be able to then probably replicate and sell to local people in London. But when he climbed up there and he did his first drawings, he realized this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do that time, the most precise representation of the London skyline from the highest vantage point of London at that time. And he produced hundreds of drawings from all directions. And once he had that, the question was what to do with this. And that's where the panorama idea that Barker had obviously much before, and that other people tried and tested, came to mind. And he tried to raise money and found investors and built then the Colosseum that I showed you before. And just for you to imagine that moment of him being in this hut, this is before commercial photographic cameras were available. So if you wanted to have a precise depiction and precise service, you had to draw it. So so this happened in 1821. 1816, Joseph Nispis invented the heliograph, but that was not a device that anyone could use. Louis Daguerre, the daguerreotype came only in 1839, and it took until like 1888 that George Eastman invented the first commercial camera, which then could be readily used by everyone. So he would have not had the opportunity to create a photographic image from that vantage point. He had to draw it, and he's done it in a most precise way. Now, how did the whole thing look from the inside? Stunning, breathtaking, because the rotunda had a diameter of something like 38 meters, and the painting would have had a length of over 100 meters, and he had to translate these small drawings into a large-scale drawing, obviously, onto the inner canvas of the rotunda. And for that, a sophisticated system had to be invented with ropes and pulleys, and artists essentially on platforms that would be swinging around and painting this thing on the wall. I mean, the risk people had to take to build this, the financial risk, the physical risk, just unbelievable. Another kind of observation, this is basically a detail that blew up. It's an archive image that blew up. And you see that the hut itself is being built up there as well. So you can kind of get a little bit of a sense of what he was thinking. He didn't want to just give people the experience of being in the center observation tower and see what he would have seen. He also wanted to actually share his own experience of going up and spending some time into the hut. So the process of capturing obviously was of in great importance to him. Right. Did anyone know about this? No? Was it remotely interesting? Good, because I thought, you know, why hasn't anyone told me about that? That's a piece of history that I think seems to be a little bit forgotten, but it's fantastic. And in the book, I give a very detailed account of what actually happened. So let's have a brief peek into what I do in the second chapter when I talk about the stage. Now, when I talk about the stage, it's not the kind of normal stage. Obviously, stages have been around for a very long time. But I talk about stages as a kind of a moving image phenomena and moving image immersion device. So this places people in the role of theatrical spectators and visitors of temporal spectacles produced in a world that was seen to be increasingly in motion. I transition in this part from the static representation of space, obviously like through photography or the panorama, for instance, to the more dynamic moving image spectacles that captivated audiences at the turn of the 20th century, a time when, for instance, Paris emerged as a focal point of cultural, architectural, and technological innovation. And that inevitably, obviously, brought me to the year 1900 and the Paris Exposition Universelle in 1900, which was an absolute pivotal point in several ways. You have to imagine that in the lead up to this, we can see a period that was marked by the emergence of all kinds of urban expansions, beautifications of cities, technological innovations, industrial and civic transformations. And with that came also a growing demand for mass entertainment. And the Paris World Fair was arguably the first large-scale event to showcase visitor experiences incorporating of what my much admired colleague Erki Gutamo refers to as vehicular amplification, a concept that involves transforming the auditorium into simulated vehicles such as trains, boats, or hot air balloons, thus creating a simulated spatial reality that went beyond merely animated images, a kind of an embodied immersive experience, so to speak. So I studied, as not all of them, but a handpicked selection of, for my view, of groundbreaking artistic and technological innovations that were shown at the expo, as well as the associated risks that they posed to both to the audiences that visited those attractions, but also obviously to the people that built these attractions, for instance, in financial terms. In fact, in some cases of these spectacles that I'm describing, the immersive spectacles resulted themselves into spectacular failures. And I think amongst them is probably the next example, a spectacular failure, but also a spectacular piece of innovation that, you know, I think every scholar of film should know about, and every scholar of architecture should know about. This is the so-called Cineorama, a invention by Raoul Grimoire Sanson, an early attempt of a flight simulator using a purpose-built 10-lens, 360-degree camera and a multiple projection system that would create a 360-degree projection in 1900. What you see here on the screen is rather rare. I've never seen it anywhere. Archive footage of a promotional event that took place alongside or the lead up to the Exposition Universelle, where he showcased, obviously with a big advertising banner of Cinerama, the balloon that he would have taken to film with a specific camera setup that he built, the descending and the ascending of a hot air balloon and a journey over Paris. And if you go a little bit in this picture, you can actually see what I'm talking about. You see here a basket, and this crazy piece of equipment would have been mounted on top of the basket. And you have to imagine now in the basket, 3 men cranking a central shaft that would, via wires, lead to the cinematographs, 10 in a row, that were interconnected and synchronized. So, and then think about that. At the time, you could only film for 45 to 50 seconds. You had to then have to change actually the cartridges. I mean, an incredible piece of innovation. And when I've done the research, you know, there's sometimes as a researcher in an archive, you feel like, oh my God, what has just happened? Because I was able to not only find these beautiful, very high resolution photographs, but also in trade magazines, I saw the actual images and the drawings of the device and how it mechanically functioned. And then in the Musée des Arts de Métiers, I found the actual device, and I could 3D scan it and investigate it, you know, down to every detail, which is, yeah, I don't know, it doesn't happen too often when you're so lucky as a researcher. Now, let's have a look a little bit of how this immersive experience would have looked like from the inside. It would have looked in such a way that, again, it would be a building, a space with a round canvas in the center. The audience would be on an elevated position in a recreated larger basket, where a standing and perhaps a sitting audience would be able to look across the rim and observe a synchronized projection of the flight over Paris. The only problem with this, and it's not the only problem, but one of the key problems, and this is why this piece of visit attraction was shut down arguably after like 2 or 3 days, is that the projectors were located in a projection booth underneath the basket. And apparently one of the projectors fainted because it got so hot in there. And the organizers of the expo realized this is a bit too dangerous, and they closed it down. Now, in the book, I describe in detail why I think it's still an incredible piece of innovation. And there's a lot of innovative things that came about that, you know, in the discovery of how this would work out, that led into further innovation. So, you know, while it failed, I think, as a commercial business and ruined probably the investment of a lot of people, to me, it really succeeded in pushing the technological boundaries and just opening up the eyes and imaginations of people, you know, what we might be seeing in the future and how we immerse ourselves in the future. But this is a remarkable, massive step from Barker's Panorama, which was a static painting. This was a moving image. This is a flight simulator. I mean, build this now with digital means and you're in business. Right. So why was this an issue? Why was there concerns about the potential overheating of the Cinerama? Well, there was very good reason, because a few years before that, on the 4th of May of 1897, there was a very tragic incident at the Bassin de la Charité, where essentially a piece of fire was caused by a cinematograph, you know, and a cinematic projection, because the projector, the lamps were powered with lit with vaporized ether, and one of those ether cartridges caught fire, and unfortunately those were not suitable for people to escape it, and it ended in the tragic loss and death of 120 mostly aristocratic ladies. And it's that kind of event that was deeply ingrained in the mindset of people also at the end of the century, when they thought about cinema, which in that form wasn't really invented yet, or just about to be invented. So it was not something that was immediately embraced by everyone. Let's go and see this attraction. It was a dangerous thing. I mean, we don't think about it in such terms anymore, but back then it was experimental and things could have gone wrong. And it is that event, the fire, that I think very much informed also this next spectacle at the Exposition Universelle that I looked at more closely. And it's the so-called Écran géant, which was showcased. It was a massive cine spectacle that was showcased in the Salle des Fêtes and the Galerie des Machines, which at the time was the world's largest iron frame structure with a wingspan of nearly 111 meters. And in fact, it was Alfred Picard, the organizer of the Universelle of the Expo in Paris, who invited Louis Lumière to actually have a cinematic show in that space. And it just speaks volumes of what people thought, obviously, about the potential for cinematic attractions, but also the trust that actually was invested in a company and in the personas of in this case, Louis Lumière. So what I'm going to show you next, if you're a little bit interested in cinema and architecture, hopefully it will blow your mind, because that's an image that I haven't seen for a very long time published anywhere. This is a very rare image. It's the actual event of the projection of the Lumière brothers in that space. And what we have here is a canvas that is 18 meters high, 24 meters wide, in a space that could hold between 20 and 25,000 people for a while. And so many people actually attended each of the shows every night. It was the most successful show at the Exposition Universelle. In total, it attracted something like 1.4 million people who would have seen a cinematic attraction. Some of them obviously for the first time. So that really introduced cinema and cinema as an experience, as a shared experience, to a mass audience, and hopefully and probably made a mass contribution to the emergence of cinema, thereafter. So again, I describe these events as to the highest level of details that I could find in my research. I know I could tell you, for instance, that the duration of these shows were around 25 minutes. 15 films would be shown, and so forth. But a more interesting kind of spatial thematic fact is that with the Salle des Fêtes being essentially around space, how would you be able to show a moving image to an audience that sits on both sides of the screen? And Louis Lumière had an idea. He found a way where he thought about, well, the pompiers, the fire department was already in the house because they were obviously afraid that the whole thing could go up in flames. So he asked the fire department to water spray the canvas, and that made it translucent enough that enough light was being projected through the canvas, and so the moving image could also be seen on the other side. They later came up with an even more ingenious idea. Instead of the fire department spraying it, they built a water tank and then immersed the screen into the water tank and pulled it up just before the show. Just a fascinating story around all of this. Anyway, I obviously can't give away all the details in the book, so I'll carry on to my next interesting moment, hopefully. So as you obviously know now that I'm a little bit interested in film and architecture, and I'm quite interested in the emergence of early film. And if you write a book about the art of spatial illusion, obviously there's no way one cannot write about the work of Georges Méliès. And Georges Méliès obviously was widely recognized as a pioneer who demonstrated that film could transcend the capturing of reality, that's essentially the films that the Lumière brothers would have shot, and transporting us into the realm of cinematic simulations and illusions. And so my interest lay particularly in the emergence of the first glasshouse studios. And you see here a presentation of that on the screen. And I see these glasshouse studios a little bit like cinematic immersive space machines designed to produce moving images that captivated and reshaped audiences' perception of space and spatial reality. This is a picture from around 1900. You see Georges Méliès here on the left-hand side as he's painting something on the canvas. You have some other pieces of canvas and background stored on a rack on the left-hand side. This glasshouse studio, when I look at it, you probably think, okay, this is relatively small, architecturally not particularly spectacular to your eyes, perhaps, but you need to consider that at the time, this was a purpose-built architectural machine. This was purpose-built to create spatial illusions and create a condition for filming illusions and artificially arranged scenes, as John Fraser calls it in his work from 1979. So there's again lots to that, and that kind of illusion machine apparatus was replicated in by other production companies, including Pathé, who completely industrialized the process. I speak a lot about that and how that relates to Méliès in the book. I had to skip it for my short little lecture here. Right. See how we're making progress? We are already in the third section of my little book here. And now I'd like to take you on a small journey where I talk about the interface, architecture and place experiences. So in this part, if you're interested, I'll go into the kind of paradigm shift in the history of architecture and design that to me occurred somewhere in the 19th and then bled into the 20th century. And I'm illustrating this, to me, very important transition from modern concepts such as spatial abstraction and spatial exploration, where space was perceived as a volume rather than a solid mass, to a postmodern reintroduced notion of spatial ambiguities. And where we were previously, with previous illusions, we were brought on board as spectators or visitors, for instance, with the Cineorama, also the Mariorama and other spectacles that I'm not showing now here. We are now engaged as users and potential consumers of spatial imaginaries. I see this as a significant shift from the stage to the interface, where architectures and objects and places are becoming kind of interfaces that shape our sense of reality. And this sounds perhaps really all very abstract to you, and you wonder, what the heck is he talking about? Let me show you this next image. That's a kind of piece of architecture that perhaps some of you recognize. And to me, again, it marked a bit of a milestone of that debate, at least, right? And that is the Bayreuth Festspielhaus by Richard Wagner, who obviously created operatic theater complexes in the south part of Germany between 1872 and 1876. Okay, if you have never visited and you're interested in operas, that's something you need to visit. Now, I'm leading this conversation, this interface design, from an earlier reading of architecture coming from Schinkel and Semper. And I see that in this kind of preceding conversation about the theory of architecture, there's quite a lot of debate among German scholars around the notion of Raumgefühl, space feeling, perhaps, or spatial sense, perhaps it could be best translated. And with the Festspielhaus, Wagner introduces, he didn't invent the word, but he introduces this notion and he exemplifies it, what it means to build a Gesamtkunstwerk. The Gesamtkunstwerk for him was essentially an experience, in this case, an operatical setting, that would combine the three foundational and very closely related art forms. And that was dance art, musical arts, and poetry. And the design of this building would have been, in its details, from a lack of ornamentation to the way everything was arranged, to the seats and the surfaces, built in such a way that people would have this kind of fused experience. And again, it's a kind of an apparatus that was created to get this all involving new sensation of being inside this kind of narrative spatial setting. When I started writing the book, I didn't know I would dive into this, you know. But once you read up on Richard Wagner's Festspielhaus, you kind of also begin to see that there are other kind of important other pieces of theoretical settings that emerged in Germany at the time that sort of are really important here as well. For instance, I cannot not talk about Hans Koeck. I mean, Hans Koeck's Schauspielhaus from 1919, yes, this again takes reference in a sense, in terms of form at least, to the panorama and completely changed the relationship of the stage and the audience with a distinctive ambition to create an immersive theatrical experience again. That was a refitting, by the way, of an existing building. So that's, to me, even more interesting. Or, for instance, the work of Friedrich Kiesler, an Austrian set designer, who created experimental stages and showcased experimental stages, so-called Raumbühne, space stage, at an exhibition in Vienna in 1924, followed, obviously that sparked again interest of people like Walter Gropius, 1927, where he talked about the total theater, a completely new architectural articulation of a space with a series of rotating spheres, again changing the dynamics between audience and the stage in quite fundamental ways. He did this for Erwin Piscator. So, and as that kind of conversation continues, I found myself entering more the kind of architectural settings that you're probably familiar with in the School of Architecture, and it's the work of Art of Loos. Art of Loos, obviously, you probably know him as a not only an exceptional architect, but also a provocative writer and theorist, of course. He developed this notion of the Raumplan. And the Raumplan's distinctive feature is that it places people in the center of an experience in which they feel enveloped by space in its converging functional arrangement along an X, a Y, and a Z axis with a mobile inhabitant in the space. If you have never had a chance to visit an Art of Loos building, I encourage you to do so and look up what his writings on the Raumplan. It's a series of interlocking spaces. It's a really an immersive experience, and it's a completely new way to think about space and how space should be designed essentially around people and not the other way around it. Right. Now, obviously coming out of modernism, I have to obviously also talk about postmodern signs and screens and what I called here spatial ambiguities. I highlight in the book the transition that took place between the earlier forms of spatial abstraction and exterior expressions, and I'm drawing obviously in this section on the work of, for instance, Venturi and Scott Brown, and I reintroduce and I talk more about this concept of mise en urbanité, where media and elements of stage design and urban spectacles are beginning to define an architectural language. To me, these things are more than advertising boards. They have a presence in an urban landscape, and they create a condition, and they ask us to engage with them, and they ask us to take them serious in the sense of what to show. I call these things urban pixels. And this leads me then to think about these urban pixels and these volumes of pixels in theoretical as well as practical terms, and I highlight this transition, again, and transformation of architecture into what you probably could call a mediated experiential interface rather than a purely physical form. This is not just a purely physical form. This is an experiential interface. And as I just showed you the stuff of Aldous laws, I kind of had this, it probably has something to do with my brain, but when I see these new things, I cannot help also relating things to other stuff that is in my mental library and that I've been spoon-fed in my architectural education. And I suddenly see these interesting analogies between and interesting parallels, the visual comparison, for instance, here between Le Corbusier's and Pierre Chalet's villa in the Weißenhofsiedlung in Stuttgart in 1927. And here we have an anamorphic LED billboard in Seoul with a piece of installation work by District. When I looked at this first, I thought like, okay, there might be some similarities, but just from a philosophical point of view, this describes a quite different condition. And I began to see that the pioneers of modern architecture, and I'm emphasizing the word pioneers, tended to think about architecture probably more from the inside as a volume in experiential terms, as demonstrated by the work of Loos, Gropius, Molinage, Charun, and a few others, all of which talked about thinking about architecture from the inside out. Whereas postmodern architecture tends to view architecture quite often as a body that exists on the outside, as a body or an image, perhaps in visual terms. Obviously, that's an extreme case here. But if you just bear with me for a moment, because when you follow this analogy, for me at least, it allowed me to think about our stance towards these pieces of architecture. And I think there are two distinctive different methods of an interaction that these pieces of architectures afford to us. The first, modern architecture tends to foster an immersive spatial experience through what you could call spatial communication, whereas I know of a few prominent examples, and you know them perhaps as well, where postmodernist examples particularly are adept to stimulating an intellectual engagement through, for example, visual communication. Now, look at this next slide. When you look at this a little bit closer, I just was like, sorry, how is it actually possible? Did you see that in the beginning? The extreme parallels between these two buildings. I don't know what's going on here, but I just, when I see this, I immediately realized, oh my God, there's more than one analogy to be made. Right, so a few words about perhaps a part of the book that those of you who are interested in digital technologies is most interesting to you, and that is the hybrid. In the hybrid, I go beyond the screen. I mentioned a widening of the concept of place illusions, both in virtual as well as in the real realm, creating a form of spatially hybrid experiences that treat us as digital citizens in an augmented, interconnected world. I am looking beyond the screen to provide insights into contemporary and more speculative art, architectural, and urban propositions. I tend to offer you also a kind of more provocative observations of what is happening today and where we might be heading to in the near future. I'm illustrating my points in the book through a series of futuristic buildings and hypothetical urban propositions, which entice us to immerse ourselves in an architectural spectacle characterized by screen-like environments where the distinction between physical and virtual, as well as the inside of a building and the outside of a building, become fluid. architectural structures and spaces, such as the previously shown anamorphic sign from Seoul, captivate you perhaps because they have a sleek, imaginative narrative. Yet, let's not forget that their true complexity lies beneath the surface. It's not what you see, it's what you not see that matters. Because these are facilitated by personal data and exchanges and a lot of ubiquitous technologies. The urban spaces you would see in a film like The Ghost, for instance, I think is a quite interesting continuation in a sense, or sort of relationship to what we're seeing here today. This obviously is a popular science fiction and new future film, Ghost in the Shell, 2017, and it illustrates an augmented reality cityscape with architectural media screens and holographic displays as defining elements in the urban fabric. Experiences such as the ones that some of you have visited, for instance, TeamLab, also introduce another concept that I found interesting, is this kind of a rise of the notion of a screen corporality. The involving dynamics between our physical body and the digital interfaces through technologies such as spatial computation in the context of extended reality or projected spatially immersive experiences. In this part of the book, I explore a number of notable commercial arts and visitor attractions. I'm sure you would have visited some of them, that have transcended the traditional perceptive boundaries to offer us a kind of digitally enabled, frameless or borderless experience without the need for any headsets, as I showed you in the very beginning of my presentation. I'm sure you would have seen things like the displays in Outernet in Tottenham Court Road, very fascinating place to visit. I see here the essence of these emerging forms of commercial art and entertainment echo that are also echoed in other pieces of architecture now, kind of a performative and a speculative architectural proposition that seems to introduce to us a new typology of experience and an entertainment-focused architecture, a trend that I think digital technologies will further increase. And here you see, for instance, what I alluded to briefly about this fluid relationship between inside and outside. There's actually a screen on the outside as well. And then when you begin to look for these kind of important large-scale screen interventions, you come across things like the MSG Arena that was opened in September of 2023 by the Madison Square Garden Entertainment Company. Obviously, it's been promoted as an absolutely cutting-edge addition to a new symbol of the skyline of Las Vegas, creating a once-in-a-lifetime, and I quote here some marketing brochure probably, of creating a once-in-a-lifetime audiovisual experience, as well as an immersive experience. Now, it's just, I'm sure there are lots of smart people in the room who would look at this and say, like, once in a lifetime, groundbreaking, yeah, perhaps, but let's not forget the Buckminster Fuller. And indeed, Bernhard Reder, already in 1961, proposed a spherical theater, eerily similar to what we actually see now being realized in Las Vegas. But that's just a little bit of a side note. And I also came across another piece of architecture that, a very particular type of building that's quite well published. Can I ask, Justin, how many of you have seen this building published anywhere? Is it relatively new to you? Good, I feel. That's good. Well, it's always nice to tell you something new. So this is the Invisible House that is built on the outskirts of Joshua Tree National Park. It's a 4 minimalist, semi-cantilever building that was co-designed by Hadley and the architect Thomas Osinski. Chris Handy, by the way, well-known film producer and filmmaker. And this building is nearly 70 meters long. And it appears to kind of hover over the desert. And depending on the environmental condition, the building kind of changes its facades and kind of dissolves and disappears in the desert landscape. But it's not the only sense of spatial illusion that this building has in its sleeve and pocket. If you go on the inside, there's another kind of spatial illusion that I'm describing in the book and that you can hopefully read up. But that is, yeah, it's just, these buildings are not just pretty buildings for me that you could look at and think like, oh yes, that's nice, or that's not nice. But to me, they help me to reflect a little bit about in what kind of day and age we live and how we see architecture. What is architecture to us at the moment? Where are the desires? You know, how does this relate potentially to broader questions around architecture and design? And then, of course, we have these things happening in Saudi Arabia, or not happening, I'm not so sure about. But I'm sure a lot of you would have heard about the Line project, but at the Line, you heard about it, a lot of people are nodding yes, but the Line is not the only very ambitious project in the Saudi Arabian desert that's part of the Vision 2030 project. You know, if realized, this building here, the Mukab, would be probably an even more spectacular and certainly extremely immersive piece of architecture that would await us to visit in the future. The Mukab project, if realized, is part of a sort of redevelopment plan of Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. The building has gigantic dimensions, 400 meters by 400 meters by 400 meters. Nearly 20 Empire State Buildings would happen to fit in the inside of this building. The real sensation, however, happens when you understand what is proposed to be happening in the inside. So the building would be an empty volume, more or less, not entirely empty, I'm not sure, there's a central spine and things like this, but the envelope, again, a panoramic setting, would be filled with a digital screen that would create a probably first of a kind of that dimensional immersive situation, an architectural situation that none of us would have ever seen before. I mean, this to me is a real world holodeck. Star Trek, you know, the creator Gene Roddenberry from the 1970s probably couldn't have dreamt up like this. This is rather spectacular, and I think we need to kind of watch these things, you know, day and age and see where they lead to. Again, I talk more about this in my text, and I'd like to leave you perhaps with a few final thoughts, and then hopefully we can have a bit of a chat afterwards. So let me make perhaps 2 points, a little bit of a reflection for me. For me, it was a long journey to write this book. It took me almost 5 years. You might think, oh my God, is he slow? But we've been in these situations before as well. Sometimes life comes in the way, and I had to run other rather large projects. And so this was on and off the burner. But a lot of changed in these 5 years as well. And it started out as a quite different book to what it essentially then became. But, you know, at one point I decided, yes, it should be a book about the art of spatial illusion. I really think about architectural design and some of the things that we are concerned about in architecture as a kind of an illusion, as an important narrative act that I think we need to further investigate. But as I was writing the book, it evolved into something way more. It isn't just a piece of text that describes a few pretty buildings and spectacles, but it became a quite severe study into other areas that I had very little knowledge about, like media archaeology, for instance. And also I'm supposedly, you know, I'm leading innovation and research projects. It taught me a lot about innovation. How does innovation happen? What are the conditions in which truly remarkable things and innovative spaces and places can take place? And also, I learned a lot about the entrepreneurs that are responsible for these spectacles, and you know, kind of what it took them to actually create these immersive experiences. So what emerged for me is a deeply historical and a very much a contextual perspective tracing not only the technological advancements and the built structures that have redefined our spatial perception, but also gives hopefully a quite contextual insight of the visionaries who pushed the boundaries of what was possible at the time. I didn't know about Thomas Horner before I embarked on this. You know, in my sort of sphere of architecture, he would never be discussed. I didn't know about the Cinerama, so it was a truly remarkable discovery for me. So in doing so, as I tried to understand what it took these entrepreneurs and, you know, to build these spectacles, I learned a lot about innovation, as I mentioned before, about risk taking, and here comes, I learned a lot about resilience. Since this is the Martin Center Lecture Series under the motto of resilience, yeah, there was a lot of resilience actually in the work that I discovered along this way. And the second point I'd like to make is that it sparked in me quite a lot more questions. And to some of these questions you can probably relate to as, you know, for instance, what happens to our sense of being in a place for our next generation? You guys sitting in these chairs. Will our age of accelerated machine learning and generative AI introduce, now that we can do it apparently, a new era of spatial illusions? What if, for example, the development of generative AI extends beyond the generation of images or moving images and ventures into interior architectural settings and even urban environments? AI is already here, right? It lies beneath the surface, but I think there's a potential chance that could also get a visible side to it, create a new kind of interface towards us, and that would have an architectural a manifestation that I think is worth to consider. So already today, robust real-time game engine software is utterly capable of mapping any kind of computer-generated image onto virtual scenes. Again, I encourage you to think a little bit more about this term, visualité. In the near future, will such technology be able to map generated content into, and under quotation marks, unreal, pun intended, environmental settings, onto real spaces to craft dynamic, immersive spatial illusions? It's for me merely a small leap, and perhaps for you as well, to imagine the possibility of XR and AI producing spaces that literally constitute an extended reality. This would signal a conceptual and paradigmatic shift from representation to immersion, with the consequence that XR spaces will impact not only our seeing, but also our body and mind, and as such, the notion of being situated in a new kind of place. And with that, I would like to end this presentation and thank you all very much for hanging in this last hour. Thank you so much.